Well, on trial. But who is on trial? You know, when people read this in John chapter 18, they're thinking that it's Yeshua who's on trial. But actually, it's quite the other way around. You know, things are not always the way they look. The people who have the power, they don't even stop to think that they could be the ones who are actually on trial. But actually, according to the Torah, when the innocent are judged, so are the judges judged. The false witnesses, and even the entire nation. Because there is a higher judge than those judges. And this is what he has said. Let's look at some of the things that we find in the Torah about judgment. Deuteronomy chapter 16 says this. You shall make judges and officers in all your gates. Judges of Israel are sanctioned by the Torah. We need righteous judges. But it also says they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. It says you shall not wrest justice. You shall not respect persons. Neither shall you take a bribe, for a bribe does blind the eyes of the wise and pervert the words of the righteous. You shall follow that which is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you. Who is that talking to? It's obviously talking to the judges, right? It's talking to the judges. Yahweh expects the judges of Israel to judge with righteous judgment. And he is very, very insistent that that be the case. Well, we have more in the Torah about this, probably a lot more than I can go into tonight, but we have some other verses. For instance, here in Deuteronomy 16, it says, you shall follow that which is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which Yahweh your Elohim gives you. Now, we just read that, but I'm pointing out this particular part of it because if these words are true, then of course the opposite is true. If they do not judge righteously, if you don't do what is just, then you will not live and you will be exiled from the land of Yahweh. You see, living in that land depended upon the covenant, depended upon obeying the covenant. And the covenant demands righteous judgment. I think that's very clear here. Now, the scripture has some things to say about witnesses. It says, one witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sins. At the mouth of two witnesses or at the mouth of three witnesses shall a matter be established. So hearsay is not enough to convict. You have to have actual witnesses. If you have a case where there's one person's word against somebody else, that's not enough to make a decision. It goes on, if an unrighteous witness rise up against any man to testify against him on wrongdoing, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before Yahweh, before the priests and the judges who shall be in those days, and the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness is a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he had thought to do to his brother. So you shall put away the evil from the midst of you. So we have instructions here for witnesses and instructions for judges. For witnesses, there has to be at least two or three witnesses, and if any are found to be false witnesses, then the thing that they were trying to do to their brother that they're lying about was to happen to them instead. And that's only right, isn't it? That's the righteousness of Yahweh. And notice that the judges have a responsibility to make diligent inquisition, to find out a false witness. And they need to be very diligent about that. Well, here's more. Leviticus 19. Again, speaking to the judges, it says, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor show favoritism to the great. But you shall judge your neighbor in righteousness. You shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people. You shall not endanger the life of your neighbor. I am Yahweh." Now, I take this where it says you shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people as an effort to get public support against someone who's accused. Whether this is done by the judges, people that some of them send out, or individuals in the community. People deserve to be considered innocent until proven guilty. And that's supposed to be a principle of law here in my country, although you don't see that happen very often. And the place they got it is right here in the Scriptures. Exodus 23, "Keep far from a false charge and don't kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked." Now, these unrighteous judges, they always say this is for the greater good. We're sacrificing this person for the sake of the nation. It's national security, friends. We're going to sacrifice some people for the good of the nation. Yahweh says he won't accept that. That is wicked judgment. Proverbs 21:28 says, "A false witness will perish, and a man who listens speaks to eternity." Now, I think this is kind of an amazing phrase, speaks to eternity, and it shows that there's also a responsibility on the part of the people. When a person is being falsely accused, when they are being slandered, when there is no proof that these things are true, just opinions and hearsay, if they accept them, if they listen to them, they themselves are speaking to eternity. That means they themselves are on trial. The nation is on trial. You know, Yahweh expects a lot of his people Israel. He expects us to be different than the world. The world does this stuff where they just slander people to get their own way, and they climb over the body of other people to get to the top. This is not something that Yahweh wants in his nation. We have to be very, very careful about our brothers and sisters and what we accept and what we say about them. In John 18:13, it says, "They led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year." Now, this is something that was in our lesson last week, but it really fits in well here to give us an idea of what was really going on a political level. When Yeshua was arrested, at first they brought him to Annas. And the other Gospels just don't report this. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that John is filling in some information that wasn't in the earlier Gospels. And we have this comment from a commentary It says, first they led him to Anan, that is the Hebrew of Annas. Only Yohanan, that is John, tells us of this irregular preliminary hearing. Anan had been Kohen Gadol, or high priest, from 6 to 15 CE. Many members of his family became Kohen Gadol after him, including 5 of his sons, as well as his son-in-law. He retained his title after leaving office, and it mentions about him that he was a powerful behind-the-scenes figure. Annas kind of reminds me of the Godfather in the Godfather movie. He was the real power behind this whole family of high priests. So when Yeshua was arrested, instead of taking him directly to Caiaphas, who was appointed to be the high priest that year, they brought him first to the man who was the real power, Annas. Now, we have some other things that we could look at, but we're going to find when we get into Acts that Peter and John ended up before the same council. And remember, this was just a little while later, the same year. And it says Annas, the high priest, was there with Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and as many as were relatives of the high priest. So even though it was not the year in which Annas was appointed officially as the high priest, everybody viewed him as the high priest. The reason this happened is this. In the Torah, there's a high priest who is appointed for life. However, under the Romans took it upon themselves to enforce the law that there would be a new high priest every year. So Annas had it all set up so that he was what you'd call the real high priest, and then he had his relatives serving every year under him to satisfy the Roman law. That's what was actually going on. So we continue to see him as the ringleader of the opposition against Yeshua, and then later on, the ongoing movement of the Nazarenes. So that helps us to understand that there was sort of a political cadre that was behind this whole trial. They had been the ones that had instigated this. Annas, no doubt, as the ringleader of the entire thing. They were the ones that were pushing it through, and they were following their own desires about this for political reasons, while at the same time having to work through the Roman law. So this was all done very politically. Well, in John 18:24, it says, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So now the high priest, the real high priest, sends him to the essentially Roman recognized high priest. And then it's interesting that John doesn't say anything about what happens there. Because really what happened there didn't really matter, because it was already decided by Annas and his crew. No doubt Caiaphas had been part of that too. So it says here, they led Yeshua, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium. Now this is the Roman governor's courtroom. It was early, and they themselves didn't enter into the praetorium that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Now what we see here, and then a later verse, is that for Caiaphas and the rest of this group, it wasn't Passover yet. It was the day before Passover. In the Synoptic Gospels, in all of them, they tell us that it already was Passover. Yeshua and the disciples had had their Passover meal together the night before. Whereas these guys, their Passover meal was still ahead of them. Now, some people say that that means there's a contradiction between the book of John and the other Gospels. And what it actually means is that the Jewish establishment had the wrong day. Yeshua and his Talmudim had the right day. They had observed the moon. They had 2 witnesses to the moon. They were redeemed Israel. So they had the right, the authority to set the calendar. These guys didn't even realize it, but they had now become the imposters. They were apostate Israel. And they couldn't even figure out the right day for the calendar at the beginning of the month. Apparently, they missed the moon, and it's probably due to some bureaucratic wrangling in their court that they held every single month, deciding when the beginning of the month would be. Perhaps they wanted the month to be different that month. Perhaps they were trying to bring it into harmony with something having to do with the Roman world or the Greek world or whatever it is. But whatever it was, they were a day late and $1 short, I think. Pilate therefore went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man weren't an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you." So this is like saying, it doesn't matter. We don't need to tell you witnesses. We don't need to bring a charge. We're simply telling you that he's bad and you need to believe us. He's guilty because we say he is guilty. Unfortunately, this is how things have been for a very long time, that people in power, their word is the law. If they say you're guilty, you're guilty. But is that Yahweh's law? Is that what he said? That's not what we found, is it? There has to be witnesses. There has to be a real case. A person has to be proven. That hadn't happened with Yeshua. Therefore, they had no witnesses that they could bring before Pilate. And it was a travesty of justice. And they're answering Pilate in this way, saying essentially he's guilty because we say he's guilty. This is an evidence of the fact that this was all political. This man was being offered up for political reasons, not because there was a real case. These things happen today, don't they? What about us? Are we fooled by this? If you hear that a person has been accused of a crime, been arrested by the police, do you automatically assume he's guilty? Don't you know that the same thing happens today that we're reading about? There are political considerations many times having to do with various crimes. Sometimes some influential person committed the crime or is affected in some way. Perhaps it's one of their relatives that does it. Somebody has to pay the bill. Let's choose that guy. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Let's us not fall for this. Let's not judge a person as guilty just because the system says they're guilty. Let's judge with righteous judgment according to the Torah. Well, going on. Pilate was a man of the world, and he saw through all that they were doing. He understood it was all a political thing they were doing. So he didn't want to be used by them. So he said, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. And then the Judeans said, it is not legal for us to put anyone to death. So now they're telling him what they really want is for the Romans to kill this guy. This very statement shows us how political all of this is. That this is a conspiracy against an innocent man by the powers of his own people. And they had a predetermined result that they had in mind. Fair trials don't work like that, friends. A fair trial does not have the verdict before the trial even happens. This very thing that you can read here very plainly is evidence that they had a predetermined outcome in mind, and they just wanted to get rid of this man who was a problem for them. This is not the justice of the Torah. Well, Yeshua went in before Pilate, and he answered Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. In saying my kingdom is not of this world, was he not owning the fact that he's a king? He was not denying who he was. He said, I wouldn't be delivered to the Judeans if his kingdom was of the world, because they would have fought to protect him. It would have been like every other kingdom, right? Struggling against one another. But he says, my kingdom is not from here. He doesn't say my kingdom is not here. He says it's not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? Yeshua answered, you say that I am a king. For this reason I have been born, and for this reason I've come into the world, that I should testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Now I find this very interesting because it sounds to me like Yeshua is setting out the standard of righteous judgment. Telling Pilate the standard of righteous judgment. And the standard of righteous judgment is Yeshua himself. That's a big statement. That he came to testify to the truth, and everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice, he says. That is pretty amazing, I think. And it shows who's really being judged. It's not Yeshua. Because if judgment is based on Yeshua, certainly he's not judging himself. These people that think they're judging him, he's really judging them. Pilate's response is, what is truth? You know, that answer is so appropriate for the times in which we live. When he says, what is truth, you know what he's saying? Truth is relative. Truth is just a perception. Your truth is just as valid as my truth, and my truth is just as valid as your truth. Is that really how it is? There is no absolute truth. A lot of people believe that today. And you know, part of the reason they believe that is because there's so much information. If you, let's just say on scriptural matters, if you start researching scriptural matters by listening to what different people say, pretty soon you're going to find out that there's lots of different opinions about the scriptures. And it would be very easy to adopt this position, well, what is the truth anyway? And put up your hands and walk away. Why don't some people do that? Why is it that Yeshua's disciples didn't do that? It's a mystical answer. Truth seekers recognize the truth, and everybody else doesn't. That's how it is. And Pilate fit in the everybody else category. It's that simple. Not meant to condemn anybody, that's just how it is. The truth seeker knows the truth when they finally find it. Well, it's interesting what happened next. Pilate went out and he says, I find no basis for a charge against him. With everything he heard from Yeshua, no doubt he was kind of mystified about a lot of it, but he didn't see anything there that told him, I'm talking to a guilty man. And that's what he said to them. So he's looking for a way out of this. Pilate is looking for a way out of this. He doesn't really want to condemn an innocent man. So he says that they have a custom that someone should be surrendered by the Romans at the Passover. It says, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Thinking, well, this is a good way to get past this. And they shouted, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas was a robber. The name Barabbas actually comes from Aramaic, and it means son of the father. And I just think it's so interesting that this is who they chose, because they chose a robber and essentially accepted him as the son of the father. But they accused the true son of the father of committing blasphemy for calling himself that. That's pretty bizarre, pretty strange, pretty ironic. So Pilate then took Yeshua and flogged him. Whew. Pilate knows this is an innocent man, and he took Yeshua and flogged him. The soldiers twisted thorns into a crown and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple garment. They kept saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they kept slapping him. Some people are quite convinced that the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial shroud of Yeshua. Part of the reason that they believe this is because it seems to show the very wounds that the scriptures talk about. And there's a lot of other evidence that they turn to, but there's also people who point to other things that say this isn't true. Now, I'm not arguing the Shroud of Turin tonight, but I thought, since it does track so closely with the biblical description of what happened to Yeshua, that this could be useful for us in understanding what Yeshua went through. What we see here is a mannequin that someone prepared that shows the same wounds that are on the Shroud of Turin, which match very amazingly close to the biblical explanation of what happened to Yeshua. And just by looking at this, you can see how completely Yeshua was beaten when he was flogged. What you're seeing here next to this mannequin is a Roman flagrum. This is what was used in order to do the flogging on a person. And as you can see, It has little bits of metal and bone in the individual strands. And it would rip in and tear the flesh. And imagine 40 strokes of that, less one, in the hand of a Roman soldier who is laughing at you and mocking you. How hard are they going to hit you? This is what happened to Yeshua. To me, it's really amazing that someone who knew that Yeshua was an innocent man would send him to have this done. Why would he do that? I think he did it because he thought maybe these people would have some pity when he would present this man in this kind of condition. And they might say, well, this is enough. I think maybe he did this thinking he was helping Yeshua. It goes on and says, then Pilate went out again and said to them, behold, I bring him out to you, that you may know that I find no basis for a charge against him. Again, that just defies my logic. And Yeshua therefore came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple garment, no doubt thoroughly bleeding from his wounds. And Pilate said to them, behold, the man. I think he had to be identified. I think the way he looked, they might not have even known it was him, and he had to be identified by Pilate as being the very same man. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they shouted, saying, crucify, crucify. If Pilate was hoping there would be some pity, I'm sure he was disappointed. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no basis for a charge against him. Pilate really didn't want to do it. They were prohibited by Roman law from doing it. The Judeans answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die because he made himself the son of Elohim. So we get this Son of God thing going again, right? Well, this is very interesting what happened. They said this to him. When therefore Pilate heard this saying, he was more afraid. They knew what they were saying because they knew that Caesar had the title of the Son of God. It was even on the coins. So, for anybody to say they were the Son of God was a direct challenge to the Caesar because he was the only one that could be the Son of God. And so, even though the high priests and the council knew what the scripture said, even though they knew that in the book of Samuel it calls the sons of David God's sons, they said this, knowing it would put fear into the heart of the governor, the Roman governor, who could then be considered a traitor if he didn't protect the name and position of the Caesar. So he was obviously troubled. It says he was afraid. He entered into the praetorium again and said to Yeshua, where are you from? Why is he asking him where he's from? Well, remember, he was a Nazarene, right? And the family of David was in Nazareth. If Yeshua would just say, well, I'm from Nazareth, at least that was something that he could hang his hat on. Saying, well, yes, this man is claiming he's from the line of David. He's the king. Because you see, they had a number of people that had done that very thing that had already been crucified before Yeshua ever came along. Yeshua did not want to condemn that whole community he came from. So he didn't give them any answer whatsoever. He did not say to them that he was from Nazareth. Neither did he say he was from Bethlehem. He didn't want to put what was happening to himself on anybody else. Pilate therefore said to him, aren't you speaking to me? He couldn't believe that Yeshua was not even answering him. He says, don't you know that I have power to release you and have power to crucify you? I wonder how many men had stood before him, quaking in their boots. Yeshua didn't even answer him. But now Yeshua answered, you would have no power at all against me unless it was given to you from above. In other words, you're not the real power here. Therefore, he who delivered me to you has greater sin. Again, what is he doing? He is vocalizing a judgment against the people that were behind this. In Yeshua's mind, as he's going through this whole thing, it's not him that is being judged. It's the people that are doing this to him that are bringing judgment upon themselves. And we know the reason. We already read it in the Torah. Their own Torah that they claim to be the scholars of and the arbiters of and the judges of was condemning them for what they were doing. And of course, Yeshua, he held them to it. At this, Pilate was seeking to release him, but the Judeans cried out, saying, if you release this man, you aren't Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. All of a sudden, these Jewish leaders seem to be very concerned about Caesar's reputation. What do you think about that? Do you think that's sincere? When Pilate therefore heard these words, he brought Yeshua out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover at about the 6th hour. He said to the Judeans, behold, your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. I think to say they were insistent is to misrepresent their earnestness. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. What kingdom were they owning? The kingdom of this world or the kingdom of Yahweh? We have no king but Caesar. And you know, through this statement, they showed up who they really were. Who they really were, and where their hearts really were. After this world, after the power of this world. Position, wealth. That's who they really were. What was the verdict? What was the verdict on these religious leaders? What was the verdict on the false witnesses? What was the verdict on the nation? What was the verdict on the Romans? Guilty. Guilty. In just a few decades, after people were given an opportunity to repent and to accept the true King of Israel, judgment fell at the hand of the Romans, the very people that these religious leaders were so supportive of. And they came and they destroyed that city, destroyed that temple. Here, what you're seeing is the Arch of Titus in Rome, where it has this depiction of the victorious Romans carrying off the artifacts from the temple as the victors who overcame their opponents there in Judea. Could this even happen if Yahweh was a just God and they had been in the right? Is there not a covenant that prevents this from happening if they're walking according to his covenant? So who is it that was wrong here? Was it Yahweh? Was it on his side of the covenant? Or was it the leaders on the other side of the covenant that were in the wrong? I think this is the question. And sometimes I read people or read things by people as if somehow it was just those mean Romans that did this and the people there in Judea were totally innocent. I think to say that is to bring a charge of unrighteousness against the God of Israel. So I don't buy that at all. I think this is absolute proof of the truthfulness of the gospel accounts of what happened and the guilt that was upon that nation. Does that mean I'm anti-Semitic and I hate Jews? No, it doesn't. Yeshua was a Jew. His apostles were all Jews. And many of the founding believers were Jews. They were righteous Jews. So I guess I am against unrighteous Jews as I am against all unrighteous people. And I would urge them to repent. And I think that's how we all should feel if we are on Yahweh's side. The Torah says, you shall follow that which is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which Yahweh, your Elohim, gives you. The fact that they were taken off of the land tells us they didn't do that. The fact that they lost their lives violently when this happened is more evidence that they did not keep this commandment, and so the stated punishment came against them. Yeshua himself said what would happen. We can find that in Matthew 24 and other places. He predicted this very thing, that the Romans would come and do this. And a little over 30 years later, it all happened. All of this should be a lesson not only to the leaders of this world and even leaders among the believers, but to all of us. Because when you look at this situation, what you realize is it's very easy not to realize your life is being observed. What you do really does matter. We are all on trial. And we face various situations that test us, that test whether or not we're going to do what is right instead of what is expedient. That we're not just going to please ourselves, but that we're going to make righteous judgments. And who will decide about all of this? Well, we do have a righteous judge. Romans 14 says this, "For to this end Messiah died, rose, and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. But you, why do you judge your brother?" We're not the judges. Are you again, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of Messiah. Now, I find this very interesting that Paul stated this to believers, because we often hear the idea that, well, you can't be judged if you've been saved. That's not what Paul said. That we will all stand before the judgment seat of Messiah. For it is written, "As I live, says Adonai, to me every knee will bow, every tongue will confess to Elohim. So then, each one of us will give account of himself to Elohim." We are all on trial. And what the fear of God means is that we recognize that. And that's what governs our decisions. Not political considerations, not just personal considerations, but his righteous judgments.
For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. You know, the apostles, they were Torah scholars. This is why I'm doing Zion Academy. The lessons include 2-hour audio programs and quiz modules. All the lessons in the Torah can be applied to us today. Not to mention, they open up the renewed covenant scriptures in a whole new level, much like the apostles had understanding of the Torah. Plus, I can do the courses in my own time, at my own pace, with no prerequisites, and at a very low cost. I can do them here. Or here.
Zion Academy students are provided with study materials, the Zion Messianic Scriptures, in-depth verse-by-verse programs, and quizzes with your final grade and a certificate at the end of the course. Zion Academy also offers assignments for students who would like to opt in to take part in the Zion Tabernacle live Shabbat meetings. Become immersed in the Torah. Find out how you can become a Zion Academy student at zion.org.
Was this video informative? Click the like button below to help spread the word to others. Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss out on more amazing content from Eliyahu ben David.